This is a very challenging time in Israel and in the Middle East, and we're going to dive in that in a moment. But before we dove in here, I just wanted to say, thinking about those people and obviously showing all the support we possibly can to those people impacted both directly and indirectly by the violence going on in Israel right now.
Prominent CEOs, leading economists, iconic investors, insights from the experts. The Walker Webcast with Willy Walker. See who's next.
You start this quarterly Linneman Letter, Peter, with pointing out that only about 20% of the U.S. economy is really impacted by these rate hikes that the Fed has been under. And you sort of say, hey, Federal Reserve, what surprises you that when you do something that only impacts 20% of the economy, that other things continue to function normally?
Right. Well, for years, the Keynesian model has never worked, and yet they're constantly surprised it doesn't work. But the 80% is not a precise number, but let me just give you a sense of what it is, okay? State, local, and federal government, about 35% of GDP. Do you think they're not hiring people because the short-term interest rate is up? And in fact, if you look at their hiring since the interest rates began rising, I'm not saying they shouldn't have hired people, they're way up. Like 400, 500,000 people hired since rates started going up. Nobody's surprised when I tell you that, right? They're not saying they're going with the rates up. Then let's go to 18% of the economy is healthcare, roughly. And if I had a heart attack right now, I'm not going to look up and say, don't take me because the rates are too high. It's not going to happen. Or there wasn't a young woman who was 2 months pregnant when the rates started to rise who said, oh, honey, we're going to have to keep it in until 2005 when the rates come down. It's not the nature of healthcare, right? And so healthcare is kind of immune. Well, just those two, you don't even have to get more sophisticated. You're at 53% of the economy, right? And then you say, okay, 25% of the people who buy cars buy it all cash. And toilet paper, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of things. And you end up with about, I'm not trying to be too precise, about 20%. What? Some manufacturing, a la autos, namely the people who are buying it with debt. But some manufacturing, not all. And all of the capital is not short-term. You have some of real estate, not all. Any of you who took out a Freddie or Fannie 10-year, that Walker Dunlop arranged for you.
Thank you for the plug. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, you took it out in 2021 and you haven't bought anything since, or you're not interest rate sensitive, right? You're happy.
That was one of the interesting things this morning on Squawk. They had this panel talking about inflationary pressures, and this woman came on and she's like, there's inflation everywhere, and it's in this and it's that, and it's in housing. And I was like, it's not in housing, because 80% of American mortgage holders locked in an interest rate under 5% in 2020, 21, and 22. Right. It's like their cost is not going up. The cost of buying a house is going up, but their cost, inflationary
and that's
pressure
going up because of a fundamental shortage of housing. That we have like a 3.5% shortfall of production over the last 15 years or so. That's not going to go away in a hurry. So you go, okay, people who locked in, lots of corporations locked in long-term debt. They're not facing. But companies who use a short-term line of credit, they're affected. I'm not saying none. On the other hand, I don't know about your company. My little company doesn't have a line of credit. We don't have a bank line, right? So we're not affected by it. A lot of consulting firms and such aren't affected. So I'm just giving you little examples. Development's affected because you're on short-term rates. If you look at development as a percent of the economy, however, it's pretty small.
Right.
Such that even if you cut development, which we finally are seeing happen. You and I talked about the multifamily numbers. We just couldn't figure out how they were possibly as high as they were reporting. And I think they're down, I think you agree, at maybe 220, 250,000 on a run rate right now. Okay, so fine. You go from, what were we at? We were like 600,000.
550 to 600, yeah.
But it was only there for a few months at 600,000, and then it came down to 550. So fine, let's say we cut multifamily from 600,000 to 200,000. It's a tiny part of the economy. You're not going to slow the economy on that, right? So when you just forget you took a macroeconomics bullshit class, right?
Not from you.
Think, not from me. Just think. I mean, I have some students here, former students. But if you just think, we were talking before that oftentimes the answer is so obvious that you don't think about it. How could it possibly have a big effect? And then you add to it, travel and tourism is still not quite back to 2019 levels. Huge pent up. Autos,
although you
still
do point out in the letter that Vegas is back and conventions are back.
Vegas conventions are back.
Because you pointed out in the depths of the pandemic, you said people will come back to conventions and they'll come back to Vegas. And there were a lot of people who said, give up on conventions and give up on Vegas.
No chance.
Right.
I mean, we like our vices. And no, but I mean, there are conventions for real when you think about it. Interacting is useful. You could have everybody sitting here could have been sitting in the closet today instead of coming and seeing Willy, right? And by the way, a lot of people now think my name is Willy Peter.
Yeah, right.
Because, because he always mentions himself first. And so some people...
I was talking to your former partner of the Linneman Letter this morning, and he said that I used so much of your data on CNBC this morning that I had to give you some props on national television. So next time I do it, I'm going to try and
we'll have a banner behind you.
I'm going to try and squeeze you in.
No.
So, but Peter, you called for a couple things that I think you got really right, and then one of them that you didn't get right, and I want to understand why you didn't get it right.
Right.
At the beginning of the year, when 60% of economists were talking for a recession in 2023, you said no recession.
Not a chance.
Not a chance. You just came out with your updated 2023 GDP growth number at 2.3%.
Right.
Okay? And you have pretty high CPI prints from here to the end of the year. High fours, low fives. Why did you, in March when we were together, think that you'd be able to have 2+% GDP growth, CPI continuing to print in the high fives and low fours, and yet the Fed would cut?
Okay, so the economy part is easy, the GDP part. We still are below trend. If you go back to the pre-pandemic trend, we're still haven't caught up. We're catching, but we haven't caught up. That's all this pent up. We want to do stuff. And you can name, a lot of it's healthcare that we forestall during the COVID. A lot of it's travel and tourism. It's not only, and a lot of it's auto. So there are things that are pent up. That's going to power us through. That's why I don't think. Now, the inflation is very nuanced, and we talked about this. Is it year over year you're talking about, or as we are happening? And the numbers are very confusing. So I keep saying inflation is massively lower than people are being told. And I'm looking at the same data. So the personal consumption expenditure price index, which historically the Fed has said is their preferred measure. Greenspan used to swear by it, right? And it was last month annualized on the core 1.3%. 1.3%. So that is to say, as we sit here, right, that's what it was. I don't care what year over year. You know, it's like saying, well, I wasn't driving my car very fast a year ago. I don't care. You're driving like a bat out of hell now. Or I don't care if you were speeding a year ago. You're sitting in the middle of the expressway not moving now, right? I'm looking at the moment. That's all I'm doing, okay? If you look at CPI, you will basically get the same picture, except it tends to run 2 to 3.5% on CPI if you annualize. Now, they'll say, well, yes, last month the personal consumption expenditure index was 4% annualized if you include energy, okay? Now, why, again, forget you went to any school. Just why is oil up? Does it have anything to do? Did the increase in oil prices in the last month or two have anything to do with the Fed? No. What did it have to do with? Saudi Arabia reduced production. Okay? And what happened to the price? Now, is anything the Fed going to do going to have an impact on that? Maybe something the White House does, jawboning with Saudi Arabia or whatever. And by the way, we had a little back and forth on this, friendly back, which is the U.S. has reduced its oil production because they were reacting to the drop in oil prices that, occurred. What's happened to the rest of the world other than Saudi Arabia since then? And we're at all-time record oil production because Guyana and so forth and so on are bringing on production because it makes sense.
But the thing that I didn't understand and that you and I were going back and forth on was this. You very clearly state in the letter 20 million barrels per day consumption in the United States pre-COVID.
Right.
COVID hits. We dropped down to 14.5 million barrels a day of consumption in the depths of the
In
pandemic.
the depths, in May of 2020.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And then we revert back for 2022 to 20.2 million barrels a day. 2023, we're at 17 million barrels a day. I don't get the 3 million barrels a day less consumption in an economy that's growing at 2.4% GDP growth. We don't have, Tesla, as much as Elon Musk wants to take over the world, we don't have Teslas on every corner. Right. What is causing us to be using 3 million barrels less a day year to date in 2023?
Clearly, some of it's efficiency. Now, that's 15% efficiency improvement a year. That's not true. Everybody would agree? Some of it is inventories have been built up and are run down, and the way they measure, right? So
does the restocking of the strategic oil reserve count in like a 20 million barrel
that
a day?
would have been part of.
That's
I don't
part
know
of the
how much
normalized.
they did restock, to be honest.
Right. I don't think they restocked any of it.
It would. So, there's a lot of things happening, but it's clear that we're consuming energy. It's clear we're on a long-term trend. You want to see, it's related to this technology issue being a wonderful salvation for a lot of our life. I was reading the other day that the Phoenix metropolitan area, which is now, I guess by population now, the 5th largest in the United States by people.
Mariposa County's been the fastest largest county in this country for 5 years straight.
So, fastest growing, okay? I think there's a couple of places where an apartment hasn't been built, but that'll balance out.
They're going to put a chip plant. Well, they didn't put the apartment, they're putting a chip plant.
Right, that'll balance.
Because chip plants don't use water.
Right.
Sorry.
How much water, here's a question. How much more water is used than in 1950 in Phoenix?
Zero. Because 70% of the water in Arizona is used for agriculture.
Yeah. The recycling of water and other technologies of whatever, your shower is less, and all that. Is that amazing? The population is like 18-fold or some crazy number-fold, and they use the same amount of water.
Right.
And that's a miracle, if you think about it, that happened slowly over 72 years or 73 years. That's a bit what's happening with oil. Although a lot of these numbers are hard to measure. It's like people forget how, one of the things we've talked about is, my view of the economy is not equations. I sometimes use equations and so, my view is not an equation. My view of the economy is go to an art museum and see a Corot painting. And Corot was a pointillist, right? These little dots. And if you get close, you see nothing except little dots, right? And then it could be an impressionist, the same point, right? And my view is, I see this big Corot painting, and if I get too close, I don't understand anything. Even though I know that dot was created by a set of chemicals and so forth and so on. But the point is, you got to step away from all that and just try to get the fullness of the picture. And I don't always get the fullness of the picture.
You get it pretty darn well.
But that's the game. And people get hung up in the chemical compounds of what makes that dot different than the other dot rather than the image of it all. And the image is constantly changing. That's different than a Corot painting, right? The image is constantly changing. So one of the things people fail to understand is the data is not so great and is not so constant. Surveys, and you go like, how many of you have taken a survey that the federal government has administered in the last 6 months? Anybody? And yet, real people do it, but they have a harder and harder time getting people to take them. Because we're also sick and tired of the phone calls that come in, we aren't answering their calls so that even if you were willing to, so the data gets more blurred, if you will. Not the fault of the government, right? And by the way, I'm more than happy to blame the government for everything.
I know, I realize that.
But
So
I'm joking.
Let's
you got to
jump
have
in.
you have to have an understanding that these things are going on. The CPI data, housing is terribly measured.
Right, and which is why you go to the personal consumption.
And that's why I come down, it's much lower. Yeah.
So you talked about Phoenix as being one of the high growth cities in the country. In this Linneman report, there are a number of cities that I put out there as cities that you show the growth in payrolls from pandemic forward. Right. So every major economy tracked by the Linneman Letter has gotten back to pre-pandemic employment levels.
Yeah, basically, there may be one or two, but I think I tracked 48 or 51.
New York, for instance, is 40,000 jobs below pre-pandemic,
right?
Just as an aside.
Right.
But so as you look through that, there are about it's a little bit more than that. It's like 8 economies that have grown by over 100,000 jobs. Mm-hmm. And one of them is the outlier, and that is Dallas, Texas, which has grown by 427,000 jobs. Payroll jobs in Dallas, Texas, since their pre-pandemic print.
Right.
Okay, and there's a lot of supply in Dallas, and we can talk about how that all plays into the housing market and all that. But one of the things, back to your equations, that I thought was so interesting was that you have a number of indices in the letter that talk about if you get 1% growth in employment, you then are going to get a tightening in vacancy rates in office and retail, and hospitality RevPAR will go up, et cetera, et cetera. And you've tracked this over time.
Right.
But in an economy of Dallas, Texas, which has added 427,000 jobs, that would equate to a tightening in office vacancy levels by about 4.5%.
Right.
On your equation, looking at all markets over a long period of time.
I assume your math's right. Yes. So
about 4.5%.
Right. I agree.
Office vacancy in Dallas, Texas today, 18.8%.
Right. So that is the problem. That encapsulates, that little example, encapsulates the problem faced by the office market, which is historically, whether it's my numbers, your numbers, whatever, there was always a strong positive correlation between net job growth and net space absorption. It differed depending on the city, differed in the suburbs, it differed over time, how much space. Always was a clear positive correlation. And what we've had for the last, 3.5 years, is a modest negative correlation. Now, you can sit here and I can sit here and say, it will revert. I believe it reverts. And in fact, one of the challenges of reading my stuff in Linneman Letter on office is explicit, is I believe it reverts back to a positive relationship. But do I know that? No. By the way, it didn't disappear for apartments. It didn't disappear for industrial. It didn't disappear for hotels. It didn't, right? It may have tweaked, but it didn't disappear. Office, it disappeared. That means the risk is really gone. So in the past, you could look at office and say, tough times. We've had tough times in office, right? And you could look at it and you could tell yourself, but as long as I believe if jobs come back, that's what I'm really betting on. Don't bet against the U.S. economy. As long as I'm going to believe in that, it will come back, and you had a sense. Now let's play it out. Let's assume it never comes back, that relationship. That makes office just riskier than normal. And by the way, if you're a lender, you're not going to step up to something that you can't quantify at all. Or at least in traditional metrics, you can't quantify. So if you think it's off-putting for the equity, it's doubly off-putting for the lender, because the best that happens to the lender is you pay them back. right? That's the bet.
So you also
that's a real challenge.
You also make a point that allocation of capital will shift now to multi and industrial and away from office. So in other words, someone's sitting there with a normal allocation, we want to put capital into the United States, your Adia or whomever, that you're going to underweight, and that's only going to push more capital flows, which then you're going to have cap rate compression on industrial and multi, and you're going to have that cap rate expansion on those that aren't getting the capital, correct?
And the reason being that if you go back to 73, 74, 75, 80, 80 through 82, 90 to 93, Russian ruble, the dot-com collapse, the great financial crisis. If you go back to those, the financial markets were in trouble and the property market was in trouble. And that was true across the board. It was true for industrial, it was true for retail, it was true for apartments, it might be more true for one or in one submarket than there, but it was true across the board. So if you wanted to, quote, bet on, I'm a believer that capital markets come back and normalize, which has always been a good bet. The only question is when, okay? And if you wanted to bet on, yep, the economy's going to do good, you could spread your bet and include offices in that, and lots of people did include offices in that. Now, the capital markets are staggering across the board. But apartment supply demand, you can find some sub-markets where it's not great, but rent and occupancy in most apartment markets, pretty good. Mm-hmm. And yes, it's not rising as fast as it was 18 months ago, but pretty good.
Well, you point out that real rents, that you point out in the letter that nominal rents still might be going up in some markets, but real rents are not.
And yeah, and I always thought that would be the adjustment, that nominal would go up, real would fall slightly because of the difference. I always thought that'd be the margin, which is important for coverage, right? Because if nominal goes down, your coverage goes down. If nominal go up but real go down, it's not great. But apartments, rent and occupancy, decent. Industrial, rent and occupancy, pretty good. Good retail, rent and occupancy, pretty good. By the way, would you like it better if you're an owner? Of course. But rent and occupancy are pretty good. Hotels, rent and occupancy, pretty good with a lot of upside.
Back. I mean, RevPAR's almost back. It's still
a lot of upside.
6% below the trajectory if we'd never had a pandemic.
Yeah, that's right. But 6% is a lot of upside.
It is.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and then you go office, rent and occupancy, absorption, I don't know if there's still a positive correlation. I believe there is, but I don't know there is. So why would the problem is if I'm going to make a bet on capital markets recovering, it's a simpler bet to go into those other sectors. And if I'm going to make a bet that the economy grows, it's just a simpler, I'm not saying better bet, just a simpler bet. And, I don't need the brain damage is kind of what I think capital markets are going to say. By the way, in the financial crisis, if you wanted to make that bet, you had to make it in any of those sectors. They were all in trouble.
Start a legacy. Start turning dreams into realities. A better world begins with you. Better communities start with us.
What ends up happening with all this office inventory, Peter? Because you and I have talked about office to multi-conversion. You're in the process of working on a project right now.
I'm working a couple of projects.
We just put a permanent loan on an office to multi-conversion in LA where B of A had put on the conversion loan. It's 280 units. The cost basis for the developer is about $280,000 a door. We put a $55 million Fannie Mae first on that to take out the $45 million construction loan from B of A. So a $10 million cash out on a conversion, home run of a deal at a $280,000 a door basis.
Good basis, yep.
But that's a unique deal. The basis I think the developer bought the building in the 1990s for $9 million. So, they had a very low basis in the actual building. But on CNBC this morning, I talked about delinquency rates during the GFC and where we are today. And the numbers are in the GFC, delinquencies got up to 8.9%. Today, delinquency rates are about 84 basis points.
Right.
Okay. But I got a phone call as I came up here from one of the major bank CEOs. And he said, hey, I just watched it on CNBC, great, but by the way, your numbers are exactly right on Q2 2023 of where we are on delinquencies. But we got a lot of office that's coming through. This one bank has about $5 billion of office loans on their balance sheet. And he said, we've taken write-downs on a bunch of them. We're watching it very closely, but we've now written that down to about 50% of value.
Mm-hmm. So here's the thing. They don't want it.
Of course, I asked him.
They don't want it.
I said, are you taking the keys? He said, no, we're trying to work with them.
Because if I've got a good borrower, good operator, good people, good borrower, what? I'm going to foreclose on them.
But at some point, somebody can't continue to pay someone can't continue to pay the mortgage. They can't continue to turn on the lights.
And, you kick the can down the road. They'll kick the can down the road, and that's what's happening. But it's a very interesting thing on office. You mentioned I'm involved in a couple of conversions. There's a conversion of GNC's old headquarters, downtown Pittsburgh, right? Whole building, except ground floor retail, right? Nice building, Burnham designed, and so forth and so on. One of its greatest assets for conversion was it was empty.
Right.
If that that's not true. A bank has its retail on the ground floor. You can imagine we want that anyway, right? It was empty. If that same building had tenants on the lease for 5 years or 8 years or 6 years for 20, 30% of the building, it's not economic to convert, just not. Because and then you go, okay, I'm involved in another with the same partner in Cincinnati. It's Macy's old headquarters. What's its greatest asset? Yeah, it's a nice building. It's empty.
Right.
It's really empty. If that building had 35, 40% occupancy, couldn't do it.
Right.
Put aside the floor plans and the windows and the plumbing, all that is on top of it, right? And so the problem with a lot of these office buildings that you're talking about, that he's talking about,
yeah.
Some of them are 80% occupied, and some are 70, some 40. And by the way, you say, yeah, it's 40, it's going to go down to 20. Not if you try to buy it, because if you try to buy it, those tenants are going to say, oh, I'm planning to stay forever. And you have to buy it. It's uneconomic. So what people don't realize, I've said this before, you and we have no children. We have a lot of children in Kenya and Germany and so on, but we have no children by birth. And I say that as I listen to people talking about how easy it is to convert office to residential, it reminds me of my friends who have no children talking about how perfect their children would be if only they raised them, right? And it's hard. It's really hard. And a lot of them don't turn out so well, right? And it's hard, but if you said to me, what's the biggest enemy of office conversion to residential? It's occupancy between 20 and 80%.
Yeah.
Then you start looking at floor plans and windows and plumbing and neighborhood and so forth. But basically, you can scratch almost everything. 20 to 80% occupancy it's not going to happen in any quick time period.
I used as you and I transitioned to the consumer here, I used a sort of a thought as it relates to back to office with Peter when he and I were talking that he sort of thought was interesting, particularly given that he's a professor. But a lot of people look at CEOs like me and say, when are you going to force people back into the office? And I'm like, if you get softness in the job market, CEOs will have a better ability to do that than just saying, hey, we're going to force you back in, and somebody else says you can work flexibly and people leave. The other thing is that flexible work schedules actually show great productivity, so it's not like you have to do one or the other, you can work on both. But my comment was that the next generation of professionals, those entry-level people who are working, we're a service economy. As Peter said previously, 8% of our economy is manufacturing, 8.
Right.
Okay? We're a service economy. And how do you learn service businesses? Being around people like him, learning from people like him. And my comment to Peter was, it's sort of like kids who would go to see the teacher in office hours. Who are the people who went to office hours? The smartest kids in the class. If you're not taking advantage of being in the office to learn from the people who are in this room, you as a starting professional are hurting yourself. You're not taking advantage of those office hours. And I hope that that gets out there rather than it having to be sort of a cudgel from CEOs saying you've got to be back in the office. It's actually more from the next generation who says, wow, I'm not going to have the opportunity to move up. But as we go to
I think that, by the way you phrased that is the most cogent, brilliant way I've heard that issue phrased, which is it is like going to see the professor. I mean, you don't have to, right? But any of you who went to see a professor were better off.
There's Olivia right there who was at Wharton with you and who used to go see you in office hours all the time.
You're
and
better
guess what?
for it, right?
Olivia is one of your best students.
And one of the bright kids, right?
Exactly.
And there are others.
So to anyone out there who's watching this, Olivia went to Wharton and went to office hours with him and went to work at Blackstone. If you want that job, that's what you got to do.
Has her own company at this point, right?
So, it's a great path. But so let's go to the consumer for a moment, Peter, because I think one of the things that I keep hearing every meeting I'm in with a client today, and I've been all over the country in the last month, is, oh yeah, but the consumer's weakening. And Steve Leisman, some of you may have seen it this morning on CNBC, Steve Leisman sat there and said, I hear all these things about the consumer going away and having all these problems. And I hate to tell you, all the data would say to you there's something that might happen, but so far you've been completely wrong and you're going to continue to be wrong. Peter Linneman in the Linneman Letter would tell you they've been wrong up until now and they continue to be wrong. Right. Let's talk about this for a moment because the one data point that everyone talks about is $1 trillion of credit card debt. And everyone's like, oh, credit card defaults are going to go through the roof. Right. And you show very clearly in the Linneman Letter this quarter that at the end of Q2 2023, credit card defaults, charge-offs, were at 2.4%, which is slightly higher than during the depths of the pandemic when everyone was getting a check from the federal government, but 120 basis points below the long-term charge-off average in credit cards. Right. So everyone's sitting there saying, oh, we've crossed $1 trillion of credit card debt, the consumer is crashing. Right. And you very clearly point out that ain't, slow down a little bit.
Well, there are two things going on, two things reinforcing one another. Let me take the first part of the credit card debt. How many of you use your credit card to buy whole lots of stuff? Everybody. How many of you pay interest versus paying it off during the grace period? And I would be willing to bet that most of this audience, most of the listeners, most of the viewers pay it off during the grace period. I actually have not been able to find a number as to how much, but my gut is lots. Lots and lots. Now, that's not to say there aren't people actually paying interest on it. I'm not saying no one. So first of all, is that not all that debt is really debt in the sense the clock is ticking and people are paying interest on it. I wish I could tell you how much. I have searched and searched and I can't come up with an answer. If any of you ever find it, please, I'd be very interesting.
Wouldn't it show up on bank?
I just can't find it in flow of funds. I can't find it as research study. Maybe it's out there. I just haven't found it.
They wouldn't have credit card interest income as a line
They
item?
don't. Well, yes, but what you don't know is against what true balance.
Right.
Against what true balance is the point. The point is, I owe them in some technical sense, but it's purely a float, right? It's not a real. Anyway, so that's one thing. You have to remember, a lot of that debt isn't really. It's legally debt, but you get my point, okay? That's one. The second thing, let's go to the consumer, okay? Let's just forget everything you know, and let me describe the consumer. Everybody who has a job, everybody who wants a job has a job. Anybody who's thinking about getting a job can get a job. May not be the job of their dreams, but that's never been true, okay? Especially for young people. Your first job was not the job of your dreams, right? Unless you had a lot of nightmares. So, which some of you did. But it was not the job of your dreams. But anybody who wants a job has it. Anybody who wants to get a job knows there's a job out there for them. Their real wealth, real household wealth, is up like 12% in real terms after inflation, up 12% versus pre-pandemic. That's like a 3%.
But the staggering thing on that is in Q4 of last year, it was up 7.5%. In Q1 of this year, it was up 10.5%. And in Q2, it's up 12.6%.
Yeah.
And it just keeps on growing.
And the point is, it's got bounces, but come on.
But what's driving that?
Well, homes.
Homes
are driving because we don't have enough homes.
Right.
And that hurts, that helps renters, helps renting, and single family renting, it helps, because they have to wait longer to get a down payment, right, as home prices outstrip inflation. But you got a job, your wealth is up, your income has outstripped inflation since 2019. So you've got a higher real income. What else? You got a mortgage, as you talked about.
Real cash.
You have
a staggering number.
You got huge real cash versus 2019, down from a peak, but still.
$4.3 trillion of real cash.
Like cash. You've got, you mentioned the people who've locked in their mortgages at low interest rate. Not everybody. But what's there to be upset about? Now, you say geopolitical? Of course. You say, and this goes back to something I think we talked about like 2 or 3 years ago. Probably 2 years ago on my 70th birthday, I think I had a Linneman Letter that said, gee, I'm 70. And if you look at all the problems that are out there, and I made this list, you may recall, of all the headline problems that are out there. I said, in my entire 70 years, you could have made a list every year of all the problems. And yet, GDP grows, wealth grows, stock market goes up. Does it go up every day? No, does And we always have a list. And your comments about Israel, I could not improve on or add to. But this is not the first time the Middle East has had problems. This is not the first time. You can go across any problem in the world. It may not have been occurring then. It may not have been occurring to you, but it was occurring. So I have effectively a daughter in Germany, and we talk in the morning, and she's very concerned about the world situation. And I say, sweetheart, do you understand what was happening in 1943 where you live? Do you have any sense of what was going on then? And I say, my father in 1943 is wading ashore in the South Pacific, not for fun. Not good. And by the way, you can go to China and you go back, 25 years ago. They had no economy. Is China's economy got challenges? Yep. It had no economy prior to Deng Xiaoping. I was there in '86. They had nothing. India, do they have a huge set of problems? Yeah. They have no economy 30 years ago. Now they have an economy with a lot of problems. They just had a lot of problems 30 years ago and no economy. And I'm not trying to be glib. I'm not trying to say things. By the way, education system is probably getting worse, but that's only since you guys have graduated.
Right, exactly. But one of the things, as you run through that picture of the U.S. consumer, Peter, and you just ticked off all of them, and it's super strong. The one thing that is down from pre-pandemic to today is consumer confidence.
Yeah.
And it's down by about 20 points. This is the Conference Board Consumer Confidence Index that you put in the Linneman Letter.
Right.
And I have to say, I sat there and I looked at all the data you put forth, and I say to myself, wow, how is it that the consumer has less confidence today than they did in 2019, given the numbers you put in there?
Okay, you want me to give a glib answer? My glib answer is a year from now, we're probably going to be electing one or the other who are basically 80 years old.
My mind went back to that.
You kind of go,
no,
really?
My mind went back to the fact that in 2019, we had cut taxes. We were spending almost 5% of GDP in deficit spending. So It was a free lunch for everybody. And President Trump gave everyone a sense, whether you liked him or hated him, that we were kicking ass.
Well, and a lot of things happen. I think we are probably in a little, in the arc of history, we're probably in a small doldrum right now. I mean, there are big doldrums like World War II. That's more than a doldrum. And then there are small doldrums. And then there are, right after the wall fell. That was, whatever the opposite of a doldrum is, right? It was kind of a good. And so the arc of history has those. But,
But on that, let me just go to one thing. You mentioned the wall. Let me go to 9/11. Because many of my Jewish friends over the last couple of days have compared what happened over the weekend in Israel to 9/11 and the terrorist attack. If you think about the impact on the US economy and the way we changed our lives post 9/11, does what happened in Israel over the weekend have the ability to have that long-standing an impact?
Probably not, because those of you who have spent a lot of time in Israel, they were already on a much heightened sense versus us. They've got political issues they got to deal with. There'll be issues coming out of that. As I talk to friends, the biggest thing that shocked is that the intelligence service didn't have much,
Heads up.
Heads up.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you take it to compared to 9/11, it was 18 guys. Okay, 18 guys, and we all said to ourselves, it was horrific. How did the intelligence services admit? But it's 18 guys. This was like what they believe 1,000, 2,000 people went through tunnels and walls more or less simultaneously. You'd like to believe that if 9/11 had been 2,000 guys, they might have picked something up, right? And that's disturbing, especially if you're in a hot seat, and Israel is geographically. So, the consumer confidence issue it's down, but it's still above average slightly, still slightly above average. There are plenty of things to be. Look,
you have in your canaries. You put it out every quarter. You have your canaries. Right now, you have 9 out of 50 canaries. That's been static for the last year.
Yeah, not much has changed except the Fed gets stupider. Well, and the reason they get stupider, I can't tell you the reason. The reason I say they get stupider is inflation has receded. Their own index shows that supply chain issues have massively fallen. I don't know why they're married to looking at year over year.
So when do they get your message? When do they cut?
Look, I've been wrong on guessing them right.
Right.
So it's almost one of these games you stop playing, but they should have cut. I was, as you know, I was writing in December. They should have been cutting rates, and they increased them twice.
Right.
Completely, as inflation was. By the way, if interest rates were determinant of inflation, please explain to me how for 8 years through the 2010s, the short-term rate was 0, and we did not have runaway inflation. Just the empiricist in you don't have to do any economics, the empiricist in you would say, gee, if high inflation is supposed to be tamed by high rates, we must have had extraordinary. And by the way, and it didn't, and there were a whole lot of reasons why. I mean, the point is it's nuanced. So.
Well, forward curve says they cut in Q2 of next year.
So the problem, I was talking to somebody,
you don't
very
agree
smart
with Q2
guys.
of next year? And I know, you're throwing darts.
I would say you're throwing darts with a blindfold on after you've been spun around.
Right.
Okay? And I'm no better at that.
We may need to do that on our next
So be careful out here. Be careful out here, right? If you made me say, I'd say the forward curve is not terribly wrong. The problem is the forward curve is always wrong.
It's been
always
completely wrong since the beginning of this cycle.
Well, and just go through history. You've got nothing better to rely on than the forward curve, but the forward curve is a terrible predictor. I made the analogy yesterday to a client that it's like exchange rates. There's a very good theoretical model of the differential of exchange rates, and it's an arbitrage theory. And the arbitrage theory simply says, gee, I could buy this currency or that currency, and therefore the difference should be the differential rate of inflation. Okay? And if I spent 3 minutes with you, you'd all be convinced theoretically that's right. Never predicts.
Right.
Never predicts. And you go, I don't know why. That's because everything moves around so much, right? And I think that's the problem with the forward curve. Everything moves around so much. There's a separate problem with the forward curve, and it happened in that period of 8.5 years I mentioned, when the rate was 0. There's an arbitrage condition on the long. And the long rate should incorporate expected inflation and so forth, but it also should arbitrage against the short rate. That is, the alternative is I just always roll the short rate forward, and the arbitrage says the expected return should be the same. Every time the Fed does something non-economic, and in the 10s it was keeping the rate really low, it pulls down the long rate. Because you say, oh, gee, if they kept it low for a quarter or 2 or 3, but when they start keeping it low for 4 years, you start going, the arbitrage condition starts pulling. And I think the reverse is happening right now. The arbitrage condition is driving up because you can sit here and say, I believe they should, it should be down, the long rate should be 3.5 to 4.
So as you look to 2024, do you think we get back to a normalized yield curve, or do you think it stays inverted?
It all depends how stupid they are, and therefore it's hard to predict. But if you put a gun to my head,
yeah,
and you said there is a heaven and this is the determinant moment, I'd say it's going to be, the long rate will be down to 4-ish.
Yeah.
Within 12 months. Why do I say that? I do
and it's a normalized yield curve though, so short rates are below
and
that?
short rates come down. And the reason I go there, let's go back to the PCE. Now, I admitted the PCE is the lowest, the core PCE, but it was 1.3% annualized, right? So let's say it's 2.5.
Yeah.
Let's say 2.5, let's just play out 2.5% inflation. And you say, how much higher should an overnight short-term rate be on safe money? And you say, I don't know, 50 basis points, some number. It's not that much at risk. So that gets you to 3 on the short rate. And then you say, what's the long rate? And the long rate should be 150 or so.
Or 200.
Maybe 200. In the old days, prior to the Soviet Union collapse, prior to Deng Xiaoping, it would be 200 to 300.
Because of the amount of manufacturing in the economy?
No, it was because there wasn't as much wealth in the world. So what happened when the wall fell, let me just use that as the catch-all, including Deng Xiaoping and India and so forth and so on. People who had no money suddenly had money. And you know what they wanted to invest in? The same things we invested in. And that included U.S. Treasuries. So we didn't create so many more U.S. Treasuries when the wall fell, but we suddenly had people competing for those bonds that never competed for it. So the spread, the normalized spread, went from 200 to 300 basis points over inflation to more like 150 to 200 over. Simply because there's more people. By the way, if you want to get your arms around what I'm saying, imagine that over the next 10 years, Africa got as wealthy as China. Okay, just imagine. And by the way, when I was in China in 1986 the first time, they were much poorer than Africa today. Okay, so just kind of putting in context. What do you think would happen to Treasury yields? They go down. Because if you've got a prosperous operating business in a country that's got high growth, you've got your wealth there, and any money I can get here, literally here, as my safe money, I'll do. And that bids down the spread.
So you've got a 2.5 Fed funds rate, you got a 4% 10-year Treasury.
Yeah.
Where's oil?
Oil, I think, has on a trend lower. Mm-hmm. We had Saudi pushed it up.
Yep.
One of the things we know about cartels is they are very hard to maintain. That's one of the things you probably did learn useful in an economics class, which is cartels can push up prices, but it's very hard to maintain because people cheat, right?
And we're at like 60% of our daily usage as far as manufacturing in the United States of oil?
Yeah.
So we're, if you will, 40% dependent on foreign oil?
Yeah. but we're not net-net. It's tricky, but we're kind of net-net neutral on oil. We're positive net on gas, natural gas. But not only do we have fracking, and people say, well, fracking is being discouraged by regulations, and I'm sure that's somewhat true. There's no doubt that
we just need refining capacity.
Well,
it's not so much getting more.
But let's talk about Guyana.
What's that?
Let's talk about Guyana. Guyana has this huge oil find, and they're really poor. And you think they're going to be deferred from pumping? And so let's say, and I'm just putting a scenario, I'm not saying it will happen. Let's just say, we say, nope, we're not going to allow any more oil production than currently existent in the United States. We're going to net zero change. I don't think that has a big effect over the next several years, because not just Guyana. I mean, there's a number of these countries, but Guyana, I mean, if you're in charge of Guyana, you're pumping as fast as you can, as much as you can. It's the only way forward in life. And we are rich enough that if we want to squander, we can squander.
So
right?
2.5% GDP growth is already in your number. Do cap rates, there's a pretty significant disparity between private cap rates and public cap rates. Pick your asset class today. Do cap rates in the private sector need to move up to the public, or do the publics move down to the private?
So this is one of these areas I've changed my view over a decade. So that means whatever I answer, when you come back 10 years from now, you may get a different answer, right? 10 years ago, I would have said, if I had to place my bet, I'd bet on the public markets. As we sit here today, I'd place my bet on the private markets. And the reason is that I think the financial crisis changed the desire for mark-to-market assets and switched it, much to the benefit of companies like Blackstone and Apollo, et cetera, to a preference for non-mark-to-market assets, or not immediately mark-to-market assets. And I think it occurred because the financial crisis happened in the fourth quarter of a year. If you were in public mark-to-market assets, you got killed, you got fired, you didn't get a bonus. But if you were in a lot of private assets, that pain was spread over time. And a lot of the assets recovered in the meantime, or bounced back somewhat. And yes, you didn't get as big a bonus, but you got a bonus and you get fired. And I think that is filtered through. And you've seen private money go way up across the board. And you saw public flows, IPOs, et cetera, go down, not just in real estate. And I think that that's fundamental. You could argue if it's good or bad, but I think it's fundamental. So I think that the public markets are not so tightly linked. There's probably an arbitrage condition of some, but it's an arbitrage with enough to offset, I don't want mark-to-market pricing. The other thing that happens, both public and private have problems, right? The public's problem is it probably overstates value when people really want in, and it probably understates them when people really want out. And for the normal holder, things never vacillate that much. I mean, most of us don't sell most days, much to the chagrin of the New York Stock Exchange, but most of us don't sell everything every day, right? Most of us are saying, okay, I guess I'm a buyer, or I guess I'm holding on most days, and we're setting our own cap rate, if you will, right? The private markets just get big bid-ask spreads and a lack of transactions. And what you and others quote is it had to transact cap rate. But what it doesn't include, what are transactions in multi are down about 75%. Is that about right?
We were off 81%.
Okay, 80%, 80, yeah, okay. Okay, so what you're quoting is the cap rate for 20% of normal.
Right.
You're not quoting the cap rate for 80% of normal.
Right.
And 80% of normal is saying that's not the cap rate. It's just not the cap rate.
So,
I mean, and if you blended those two, in other words, if you could go to the people who would have sold and gotten an honest answer, what do you believe the cap rate is? And you blended that in with what you sold at, cap rate would be much lower. Because 80% of the observations would be lower cap rates.
So if I'm sitting here today with an asset that I either am thinking about refining or about selling, I hear you say a year from now, I've got lower rates and I've got lower cap rates. I don't do something today, I wait till tomorrow.
Or you try to get a flex program. You try to get some kind of flexible program where you convert into. The one thing you don't want to do is mature into a funky capital market. History has proven that. And so
look in that crystal ball. What's a funky capital market?
Well,
24,
I mean,
25?
don't take a 1 year if you could get
Yeah.
a 3 year.
Right.
I mean, I guess I'm saying, right?
And does the election risk in 2024 concern you?
Well, I'll be like whoever the president is at that point, so old that I won't be able to be concerned by anything.
Okay.
No,
And so
does
then-
the election concern me? I believe in, and I've said this, I've lived, it's kind of back what I was saying. You know, we've had good presidents, bad presidents, good Congresses, bad Congresses. We've had high taxes, low taxes. We've had Republicans, Democrats, blah, 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 over my lifetime. And the one thing is we grow. We don't grow every minute, but we grow. And real estate's a long-term asset. I'm not being Pollyannish. It's a long-term asset. And I'm going to bet on that growth.
And do you think we can get our fiscal situation in control without a Speaker of the House? And obviously, we're going to have a Speaker of the House at some point.
Well, there is an argument to be made if they're so busy fighting one. When Bill Clinton was
When they're so busy fighting each other, the Biden administration can pass a Build Back Stronger bill with $1.8 trillion in it.
Yeah, I get it.
Sorry.
I get it. No. They weren't fighting enough. So what, you know, so
We just got to shut them down.
So I first had this, quote, insight when President Clinton was being impeached. And I thought, this has got to be awful. And then I realized Congress was so happy beating up on him and defending him, they did nothing. And I'm doing this from memory. I think the total cost of that was something like $300 million, defending him and attacking him. And I divided that by the population one day.
And it cost all of us
it was like $18. You could go to the movies. And it was just great entertainment value, is the way I view it.
One of the other things
right?
you put in the Linneman Letter, you put in the Linneman Letter presidential popularity. And you watch that and you look at where Clinton went out of office. Man, oh man, was he ever popular when he called it a day.
It's like, well, I'll give you the equivalent of that. When I'm finished here today, there's going to be a big round of applause.
There you go.
But not because I was good, but because I'm done.
Because you're done.
You got to sort these things out. No, but the politics matter.
We got a minute and a half left.
The last thing I say is politics matter, but not nearly as much as we talk about them. Not nearly as much. Your fourth grade school teacher matters, but not nearly as much.
35% of our GDP is spent by the government. And you're telling me that doesn't matter?
It matters, but it doesn't change a whole lot. It doesn't change. By the way, it changes who gets things.
Boy,
the government is much more about
I'll tell you, all of our borrowers who were watching
it.
a 482 10-year last week come down to a 450 10-year certainly feel like Janet Yellen has a big play in their world today.
I'll restrain myself. Look, does the government have some effect? Absolutely. Does the economy grow 2 to 3% a year because of the government or not? No. It might grow 20 basis points less a year, 30 basis, and then when you do that, you go, oh my God, that's $60 or $80 billion.
Right.
And if the $60 or $80 billion is your $60 or $80 billion, it's painful. But in the big picture, ruining $60 or $80 billion is nothing. Now, by the way, if you're Zimbabwe, it's everything.
No, right.
We're not Zimbabwe. We have the luxury. We all had really rich friends at one point in life that could do really stupid things and still survive, that you couldn't survive. We're that person. We're rich enough, thank God, that we can survive 20, 30, $50 billion mistakes a year. Would we be better off if we didn't have those? Of course. But that's the world. That's the world.
And that's going to be the final word. Peter, thank you as always. Everyone here, thank you for joining us today. And everyone on the webcast, thank you for dialing in. We'll see you again next week and have a great day.
Thank you.